Good morning and welcome to Study the Word. This is brought to you by the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. We're glad you've joined us today. In just a few moments we're going to deal with yet another Bible question, and you will see a phone number appear at the bottom of your screen throughout today's telecast. Jot that number down. Give us a call if you have a Bible question. We'll deal with it on this program. At the end of our program today, we will give you some free Bible study help, so we hope that you'll stay tuned for that. All right, we're going to get into this week's Bible question. It might seem like a rather silly question. Matter of fact, it's anything but. Reason being, we are going to devote 3 programs to this one question. And what is the question? It's this: can you explain the Bible? Well, that might seem silly. I mean, how can you sit back and explain the whole Bible to somebody when they ask that question? At least in just a short period of time, you just can't do it. But really, I think that question deserves some attention, because when somebody wants to know what the Bible is all about, it's very important that they get an overview of the Scriptures, to get a timeline in their head so that when they open up their Bible, they'll know what certain books or where certain books fit within that timeline. So many people are confused because they really don't understand what the Bible is all about. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to, in an overview, take 3 programs and help you to understand what the Bible is all about. We're just going to take it from the standpoint that a person knows nothing about the Bible. And actually, by the end of our 3rd program, over this span of these 3 weeks, so we hope you'll tune in next Sunday, and of course the Sunday after that, and continue on, because we're going to be here each and every week, Lord willing, 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings. But to understand the Scriptures, we really need to get an overview, a proper overview. Now, when we open up our Bibles to the table of contents, you're going to notice that there are a whole list of words there, names even. You know, words like Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. You're going to see in your table of contents that the Bible is divided into 2 parts. There's an Old Testament and there is a New Testament. There are 66 books found in this Bible. The word Bible in and of itself means a collection of books. So really, what we have here is a small library. 66 books. 39 Old Testament books, 27 New Testament books. But I know there have been people who have heard terms like the Israelites, the Jews. They've heard the tabernacle, and they want to know, what does that all mean? And I'm confused, and how does that fit into my life? Here I am living in Indiana or Kentucky in the year 2011. How can this Bible be relevant to me today? Well, without an overview, you're not going to understand that. So we want to start with the very basic fundamentals and give you the overview of the Scriptures. And we'll put all those pieces together, and after our 3rd program, you're going to be able to handle the Word of God properly and prevent yourself from being led astray. So what we're going to do now is focus our attention on the first book of the Bible. It's the book of Genesis. Now, the reason we're going to spend our whole program on just this one book is because it sets forth some very important fundamentals for us to build upon. Lord willing, next week we will cover the book of Exodus, which is the 2nd book in the Old Testament, all the way through Malachi. Yeah, we're going to cover 38 books in our next program, and only 1 book in this program. And in our 3rd program, we'll cover the books of the New Testament, and you'll see how it all fits together. All right, we need to go ahead and get started. Now remember, I'm just going to give you the highlights, and if you'll be patient with us, you'll see how everything comes together, especially when we finish up with our 3rd program. If you would like a copy of this series, by all means let us know. We'll make copies on DVD and mail them out to you at no cost. All right. When a person opens up their Bible to the book of Genesis, and the word Genesis just means beginnings, and there are a lot of beginnings that took place in this book. The beginning of the world, the beginning of man, the beginning of sin, and all those things. So let me just take you through a little trip through the first book of the Bible, and hopefully whet your appetite to tune in next week as we cover the rest of the Old Testament, and then the week after that with the New Testament books. And so we're answering the question, can you explain the Bible to me? And we're going to do the best we can in a short period of time. All right. As you open up the book of Genesis, you'll start reading in the first chapter. You'll learn about creation, how God created the world in 6 days. As we move over into the second chapter, and it's also chapters 1 and chapters 2, chapter 2 gives us a little bit more detail, but we read about the creation of man, the first woman and the first man, Adam and Eve. And how we read how that God gives them law. Now this is before sin even entered the world, which I find rather interesting. That we would think that a perfect place, a place that we might consider like a paradise, would have no rules. Well, here it is. God puts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and gave them laws. They were to tend the garden. They were to take care of it. And of course, they were told to not eat of that particular tree, the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of it. Well, as you continue on, we read in the third chapter how that man breaks God's law. Eve is deceived. Eve takes the fruit. She eats of it, and she gives to her husband, and he also eats. And we notice that there are consequences. Early on, we learn that when God gives law, that there are consequences to breaking his law. That's a fundamental that has never changed since the beginning of time. So just keep in mind at this stage, we're not going to get bogged down with a lot of details. We're trying to give you an overview and give you this timeline that's going to help you as you study the scriptures on your own. So, as we're going through the book of Genesis, we talked about the first and second chapter, the third chapter where man broke God's law, and of course that there were consequences. They were put out of the garden, and when they were put out of the garden, they grew old and eventually would die. While they were in the garden, they had access to the tree of life, and as long as they ate of the tree of life, they wouldn't grow old and die. But there were consequences to sin, and sin separated them from God, and that's what sin means. It's a death. It's a separation. Well, as you continue reading on through the book of Genesis, we read how that the increase of sin was there throughout the world, and of course this upset our Heavenly Father. In Genesis, the 6th chapter, for example, it says in verse 5, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he even made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart." And so God was going to destroy the sinful people, but he looked and he saw a good man by the name of Noah. You might be familiar with the story of the flood. Well, a lot of people know about the flood, but it's important that you know why there was a flood. And the reason why there was a flood is because the world had become sin-infested. Everybody had become so evil. The thoughts of their heart was evil continually. Could you imagine that? Always thinking evil. And so God was going to destroy it with a flood. He saw a good man by the name of Noah and asked him to build the ark. That's where he brought in the animals. Who was on the ark? Well, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. And so there were 8 people that were on that ark that survived the flood. Well, after you read about that story, as you progress through the book of Genesis, you're acquainted with the story of the Tower of Babel. And what that is all about over there in the 11th chapter is that the people there didn't scatter like God wanted them to replenish the earth. they stayed together, and they were trying to build this huge tower all the way to heaven. And this upset the Lord, and so as you read through this in the 11th chapter, we find that God says in verse 7 of Genesis 11, he says, "Come, let us go down and there and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city." And so, that's when the different languages began. Biblical history records that. And so the people scattered. Because not everybody could understand each other at that time. So those who could understand one another went one way. Those who could understand each other would go another way. And so that's when the languages were changed. Well, as we continue on through our reading, we find that we are introduced to a very important Bible character in the 12th chapter. His name was Abram. His name later was changed to Abraham. You can read that in the 17th chapter of Genesis and in verse 5. So we're introduced to this great man of God named Abraham. Now Abraham, remember, through our history right now, we don't have the Israelite nation. And who are the Israelite people? Well, we're not even introduced to that yet. So we're trying to give you a little bit at a time. But we've brought you along where sin entered the world, it increased, there was a flood, there was the Tower of Babel, people scattered. Now we're introduced to a character by the name of Abram, or Abraham. God gives him 3 promises. Very important to remember. He says that through his seed he would become a great nation. 2, they would be given a promised land. And 3, through his seed all nations would be blessed. That is very, very important for you to understand and to remember. I'm going to bring that up a little bit later in our studies when we get into the New Testament. But just to save a little bit of time so that you can see that there is a link between what happened in the beginning and what happened 4,000 years later or so, I'm going to a New Testament book now. I don't want to confuse you, and I don't want to get ahead of you, but I just want to make a very important point here. Over in the book of Galatians, the 3rd chapter, I read this in verse 28. He says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. What promise? It's the promise we're reading way back here in Genesis, the 12th chapter. But these pieces to the puzzle will all come together as these 3 programs unfold the overview and a timeline of the Bible. We're answering the question today, can you explain the Bible? And that's what we're doing here. So, we are told about Abraham here. He was given these promises, but remember, it was through his seed that these promises were made, but Abraham had no children. He was very old. Both him and his wife. But God eventually blessed them with a child. And when they had this child, Isaac, when Isaac was a lad, the Lord tested Abraham's faith and asked him to take his child and sacrifice him to the Lord. That was truly a test of faith because Abraham knew the promise that God had made, and it was through his seed all these promises would be fulfilled. But Abraham trusted God. He knew that if he did sacrifice his son, God would have the power just to raise him back up again. And so when Abraham was about to kill his son, an angel of the Lord stopped him, and he didn't have to kill his son, but he demonstrated to the Lord how much faith he had. That might seem rather cruel, doesn't it? I mean, wow, who would ask somebody to sacrifice their own son? Well, the Father in heaven did not ask Abraham to do something that he wasn't willing to do, and the Father did do that, by the way, when he sent his son. But again, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. We're progressing through the book of Genesis here, folks, building a foundation so that will help us as we study next week when we cover the books of Exodus through Malachi. You might think, Chuck, how can you cover those 38 books in a 28-minute class? we can do it, but you just have to pay attention. And of course, you can request copies of this. So Abraham has a son named Isaac. And as you study through the Word, we find that Isaac in chapters 21 and 22, that Isaac is given the same three promises that Abraham was given, which makes sense. You have the nation promise, the land promise, and the seed promise. Isaac has a son named Jacob, and in the 25th chapter and in the 28th chapter of Genesis, we find obviously that Jacob is given the same three promises from God that was given to Abraham, that was given to Isaac. What were those three promises? You become a great nation. You will receive a promised land. Through your seed, all nations would be blessed. Not just Jews, of course we're not even there yet, but all nations. And this is before the Ten Commandments was even given. I want you to understand that when God talked to Abraham and gave him those promises, Moses going up to Mount Sinai that you're familiar with, there's been movies made about the Ten Commandments, that doesn't happen for another 430 years. We're covering some history that's going to bring us up to that point, that we will start with Moses, Lord willing, next Sunday morning. Giving you this overview, explaining the Bible. So what do we have so far? We have, as we're going through the book of Genesis, getting this timeline, creation. He created man. Man was given law. Man broke the law. The increase of sin. There was a flood. We're introduced to a man, well, then we talked about the Tower of Babel, the people scattered. Then Abraham is introduced. The three promises were given to him. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. He was given those promises too, both those sons. Then Jacob, as we're reading through the scriptures, has 12 sons. And you can read that in Genesis, the 35th chapter. Now what's interesting about this is that most of the second half of the book of Genesis focuses now on one individual. And that's one of the sons of Jacob. Remember, he had 12 sons. But he had one son, and his name was Joseph. And he loved Joseph more than the other sons that he had. Now that didn't go over well with his other sons. Matter of fact, you will read how that Joseph had dreams. He dreamed that even his father and his brothers would one day bow down to him. That did not go over well with the brothers, since he was the younger one. And so one day, as you're, and this again, you can read through the book of Genesis and get the details, but I'm giving you the overview. We find that Joseph one day was sent out by his father, Jacob, to go check on his brothers. His brothers saw Joseph coming. They said, "Here comes that dreamer. Let's take him and kill him." Well, they didn't kill him, but what they ended up doing was selling him as a slave. And they were going to take him to Egypt. Not him, but the people that they sold him to. Now remember, Joseph didn't do anything wrong. His father favored him. He had dreams that God gave him. Even his father gave him a coat of many colors, which he didn't give to the other sons. So they were very jealous of Joseph. And so when they eventually sold him as a slave, they understood that they now have to go home to their father. And so what are they going to say when he starts inquiring about Joseph? So they took Joseph's special coat of many colors, they killed an animal and put animal blood on it. So when they went back home to Jacob, they showed Jacob, their father, the coat and said, "We have found this." And Jacob jumped to the conclusion by saying, "An animal has killed my son." So he was grieving over the loss of his son. He thought his son was dead. His son was very much alive, but he was taken to Egypt and sold as a slave. Now the story focuses more on Joseph. What happened to him while he was in Egypt? Well, while he was in Egypt, he was sold to Potiphar, a very powerful man in Egypt. And he was good to Potiphar, and Potiphar could see that Joseph was a good man. You see, godly qualities are evident in people. And Potiphar trusted him with everything, even his money. He just gave him control of it all, and Potiphar knew that he could trust him. But there was a problem in Potiphar's household. It was Potiphar's wife. Every opportunity she had, she tried to get Joseph to come and be with her. And Joseph wouldn't do that because he knew she was a married woman and he would just walk away. He didn't want anything to do with it. And that was good for him. Well, one time when Potiphar was away, Potiphar's wife grabbed Joseph when he came in to serve her. She grabbed him, but Joseph, so determined to get away, ran, and she held on to his coat, and he fled, and she left holding his coat. Well, she was very upset about that, so when Potiphar came home, she said that Joseph attacked her. And all Potiphar could do was believe the wife, and so Joseph was put in prison. And while Joseph was in prison, two other people were put in prison, a baker and a butler of Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And those individuals had dreams. And Joseph had the ability to interpret those dreams. And he told the butler that in 3 days he would be restored, and he told the baker in 3 days he would be killed, and they came to pass. Why is that information so important? Well, all Joseph asked the butler to do is please remember what he did. Joseph was in prison. And remember, he didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do anything wrong when his brother sold him. He didn't do anything wrong when Pharaoh put him in prison. And there he is, still trusting in God and serving God, even though all these bad things are happening to him. As you read through the book of Genesis, you will read how that the Pharaoh had dreams, and nobody could interpret it. And one day, the butler told Pharaoh that, when he was in prison, there was a man there who interpreted his dream, and it came true. And so they sent for Joseph, and Joseph told Pharaoh what his dreams meant. Now, one of the dreams that Pharaoh had was that there were 7 skinny cows who ate 7 fat cows. And after the skinny cows ate the fat cows, they were still skinny. And of course, Pharaoh's telling Joseph, well, what does this mean? And Joseph says, I know what it means. It means that the land, the surrounding areas, we are going to be blessed with 7 years of plenty. But that's going to be followed by a 7-year famine. So Joseph told Pharaoh that you need to put somebody in charge of saving up food to get us through the lean times. So during those 7 years of plenty, we need to be storing up food so that when those lean years come, we have enough food to get us through those 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh decided to put Joseph in charge. So here it is, Joseph rises to great heights. That's what you're reading as you go through the book of Genesis. And you're sitting there thinking, what does this have to do with everything? You have to be patient, folks. You remember the promises that were given to Abraham. And of course, we're asking the question, when did Abraham's seed become a great nation? That's what we're trying to understand. When did they get this promised land, and where's that? And what is this seed promise that all nations would be blessed? That's what we're dealing with the overview of the Bible. And it's going to help you immensely in your personal studies. So we'll give the overcap in just a few moments as we're just about to finish up the book of Genesis. So we have Joseph in Egypt, now rises to great heights. The famine hits. The famine hits all areas, not only in Egypt, but where his family lives. Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to go get food and to go buy food for them. And so when the brothers come, obviously Joseph has changed. They don't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them. He doesn't say anything. The brothers come and they bow down to Joseph, a fulfillment of the very dreams that Joseph said or told them about back when he was at home with them. And it's coming true. And to make a long story short, eventually what you find is that Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And he says, go and bring my father. I want to see my father. Now they were afraid of Joseph when he revealed himself to them. But Joseph said, don't be afraid, because God had a plan. And when you stop and think about that, folks, there's the wisdom of God, and we need to learn that lesson. Sometimes things look so bad in our lives and we wonder why. But you realize if Joseph was not sold as a slave by his brothers, his family would have starved to death. Through God's providence, Joseph was able to go to Egypt, rise to great heights, provide food so his own family could live. Anyways, Pharaoh, who appreciated Joseph so much, said, invite your family to come and live, all your family to come and live in our area. And so Joseph's family came to Egypt, and they lived in a certain part of the land there. And the people grew, and they grew, and they grew, and while they were in Egypt, they became a great nation. Promise number 1 was fulfilled. You read that in Genesis 47, verses 27. They became a great nation. Unfortunately, the Pharaoh that invited Joseph's family to come and live, he eventually died, and another Pharaoh was appointed who didn't know Joseph. And the people of Egypt looked at all the people that were there, the Israelites, because when Jacob was to come and live in Egypt, that's when God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. Folks, that's where you learn the term Israelites. Israel, the people of Israel were in Egypt, and they grew and they became a great nation, and they were called the Israelites. What happened after that with the new Pharaoh? And the people were afraid. The Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites, so that Pharaoh made them slaves. Made all of them slaves. Even though they were a great nation, they were slaves. But what about the second promise? The land promise. When does that all come into play? We're going to talk about that next week. But I want us to see what you've learned today in the foundation of understanding the Scriptures. It started with those promises to Abraham. Those 3 promises, nation, land, and seed. And we've seen how it was fulfilled. People tell you, how did they become a great nation? It was all because of Joseph, his family being invited. Jacob comes, his name was changed to Israel. They were called the Israelites, and they grew and grew and grew. And Lord willing, next week we'll pick up with the story. Folks, we want to thank you for being with us today. And remember, you can request copies of this, and we even have printed information here so you can read up these verses and get that overview. And please tune in next week as we continue on with our study as we cover Exodus through Malachi, and Lord willing, the week after that we'll cover the New Testament books so we can answer that question completely, which we've been dealing with today. Can you explain the Bible? This afternoon, folks, at 2 o'clock we have our live radio program, 1400 a.m. 2 o'clock, tune in for that. The River Ridge Church of Christ meets at 3 Sharon Place in the heart of Newburgh. Check out our map on our website, riverridgechurch.org. We'd love to have you. Come and be with us. Yeah, have other Bible questions? Get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. May it always be our desire to hunger and thirst after righteousness, to rightly divide the word of truth, which is what we're trying to accomplish with this series. Thank you, folks, for tuning in today, and have yourselves a great day.